The most feared Korean Mafia boss in Los Angeles just stormed into his own kitchen and found his entire organization eating dinner made by the woman he barely looked at. 50 hardened criminals, every one of them loyal to a man who ruled by fear. Until she walked in with a pot of soup. If you've ever been underestimated by everyone around you, stay with me. Subscribe and follow this story to the very end, because what happens next will shock you. Hit like and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The night Kang Jae-hyun found out his men were sneaking into the service kitchen, he had just returned from a meeting that nearly ended in bloodshed. 3 hours of negotiating with the Trin organization in Koreatown. Low voices across a lacquered table. Tea nobody drank. 2 of his lieutenants standing behind him like walls. The kind of meeting where you don't blink wrong, where every silence is a test of nerve, and where the wrong word means bodies before sunrise. He came home to his estate in Bel Air the way he always did. Through the private side entrance, past the guards who snapped to attention, through the corridor that smelled of polished stone and expensive nothing. His jacket was still on. His jaw was still locked. The tension of those 3 hours was still living somewhere behind his eyes. He should have gone directly upstairs. Instead, he heard laughter, not the careful, controlled laughter of men performing comfort in front of their boss. This was something different, low and real and slightly too loud, leaking through the walls of the East Corridor like heat through old pipes. He stopped walking. His head turned the way it always turned toward an anomaly, slowly and with complete attention. One of his personal guards, a man named Chul, who had been with the organization for 11 years and never once relaxed his posture in Jae-hyun's presence, was standing at the far end of the corridor with his jacket off, holding a bowl in both hands, laughing at something someone inside the room had just said. Chul didn't notice his boss standing 30 feet away. Chul was too busy laughing. Jae-hyun had not seen Chul laugh in 11 years. He followed the smell before he followed the sound. Something warm and layered, the kind of scent that reaches into a part of the brain that doesn't think in language. A part that only remembers. Simmered broth. Fresh bread. Something underneath it he couldn't immediately name. He pushed open the service kitchen door. The room went silent so fast it was almost violent. 53 people. He counted later, but in that moment he only registered mass. Bodies pressing back from long prep tables. Men straightening spines and dropping bowls and finding places for their hands that weren't their mouths. Veterans who had put men in the ground for him. Young recruits still learning which fork meant what at formal dinners. His head of security, Park Sung-jin, a man with a scar that ran from his left ear to his chin, standing with a piece of bread halfway to his face. Nobody breathed. Jae-hyun stood in the doorway and said nothing. He looked at the room the way he looked at every room, methodically, from left to right, cataloging. The folding tables pushed together to make one long surface. The mismatched stools and chairs pulled from storage. The empty bowls stacked near the sink. The smell of something that had been cooking for hours. Then he saw her. Amara was standing at the far end of the kitchen beside a large pot, a ladle still in her right hand. She was wearing a plain dark apron over a house dress, and there was steam curling near her face from the open pot, and she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen directed at him in a very long time. Not fear, not apology. She was waiting to see what he would do. He looked at the room one more time. Then he said, in a voice that carried all the way to the back wall without needing volume, "Anyone who enters this kitchen again without permission will answer to me." Every person in the room stared at the floor, except Amara. She kept her eyes on his face. Then from somewhere in the back, near the bread station, a man lowered his head and said quietly, "Boss, we would rather skip dinner than stop eating Mrs. Kang's cooking." It was Do Kwang-soo, 61 years old, in the organization since before Jae-hyun's father died, a man with 3 broken knuckles on his right hand that never healed straight. Do had once held a cargo dock in Long Beach for 48 hours against a rival crew with 4 men and no backup. He had never, in Jae-hyun's memory, said anything in a group setting that wasn't in direct response to a question. The room was so quiet after that, Jae-hyun could hear the pot simmering. He looked at Do. He looked at Amara. He looked at 51 other men who were waiting with genuine anxiety to find out if their dinner was being taken away. Kang Jae-hyun, who had an answer for everything, who had never walked into a room he didn't immediately control, turned around and left without a word. He stood in the corridor for a moment with his hand against the wall. Then he went upstairs. He did not understand what had just happened, but he understood that something had, and that it had been going on long enough that 53 people were comfortable enough to laugh in his house, which meant it had been going on long enough that it had become normal, and he had not known. That was the part that stayed with him as he walked to his room, removed his jacket, and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the light. His wife had done something inside his own house, under his nose, and everyone he employed knew about it, and he did not. He sat in the dark for a long time. Amara Brooks had arrived at the Kang estate 7 months earlier with 2 suitcases and no illusions. She was 31 years old, a full-figured black woman from Atlanta whose grandmother always told her she had a face that made people put their guard down, which Amara had spent most of her adult life learning was not as purely complimentary as her grandmother intended. People who put their guard down sometimes resented you later for being the reason they did. She knew what the marriage was. Her family's legal firm had navigated the Kang organization's domestic affairs for a decade, careful technical work that her father described as adjacency without exposure. The Kangs needed a particular kind of alliance formalized. The Brooks family needed protections that only a certain kind of relationship could provide. Nobody used the word arranged in any room she was present in, but she wasn't a child. She had agreed, not because she was told to, because when she looked at the alternative, the slow dissolution of her father's work, the quiet threats wrapped in business language that had started arriving at the firm's address, she made a calculation. It was her calculation to make. She made it. What she hadn't fully prepared for was the silence of the place. The Kang estate was enormous, and it was beautiful in the way that expensive, deliberately empty things are beautiful. Marble floors that reflected light evenly, art on the walls that nobody in the house appeared to actually look at, staff who moved through the corridors with such deliberate discretion they felt less like people and more like the architecture getting up and walking around. And everywhere, the system. Seo Min-kyung ran the system. Jae-hyun's aunt was 63, lean, impeccably dressed in a way that suggested she'd decided decades ago exactly what kind of woman she would appear to be and had never reconsidered. She welcomed Amara on the first morning with tea and a smile so precisely calibrated it could have been photographed for a magazine about politeness. "We're so glad you're here," she said. "The household has its rhythms. I think you'll find it all very manageable once you understand how things operate." The word manageable landed like a small weight dropped on a glass table. Over the following weeks, Min-kyung's management of Amara's integration into the household was thorough, elegant, and completely suffocating. The professional chefs handled all kitchen matters. The household had employed the same team for 12 years, and they were exceptional. The interior design was maintained by a firm that came in quarterly. The staff had their assignments, their schedules, their chain of command. Amara's role in the practical running of the estate was, as Min-kyung communicated through 100 small architectural courtesies, nothing. She was the wife. She was to attend the appropriate functions, to be present at the appropriate meals, to be, in every way that mattered to the organization's external appearance, the appropriate person standing beside Kang Jae-hyun. Amara sat through the first formal dinner in the main dining room and watched 12 people eat in a silence so complete she could hear the ice shifting in the water glasses. Jae-hyun sat at the head of the table and spoke when someone brought him something worth speaking about. He wasn't cruel. He'd been entirely correct in everything he'd said and committed to during the negotiation process. She had been protected, provided for, treated with formal respect. But he didn't look at her during dinner. Not once. She went back to her room and sat in the chair near the window and looked out at the grounds below, where 2 guards were doing their rounds along the tree line with flashlights, and she tried to locate inside herself something that felt like a plan. The 2 suitcases were open on the floor, the clothes in one, the journals in the other, her grandfather's handwriting in the journals, the letters tall and cramped from his thick fingers, his recipe notes mixed with observations about people he'd fed over 60 years of cooking in Atlanta. Her grandfather Charles had run a small restaurant for 40 years. Nothing expensive. The kind of place where the light was never quite bright enough, and the booths were slightly sticky, and the food was so good it made the room feel like a different room. He had given her the journals 2 years before he died. He told her they were not just recipes. You can feed people anything, he'd said, but when you cook with attention, real attention, to who they are and what they need, they feel it. They taste it. Can't explain it, but they feel it. She believed him. She had always believed him. She looked at the journals on the floor of her beautiful room in this fortress of a house and thought, nobody here has eaten anything that felt like anything in a very long time. The night that changed things wasn't planned. She wasn't looking for a moment. She was simply awake because she was always awake at 2 a.m. in a new place, her body still calibrating, and she'd gone downstairs for water. She heard them before she reached the kitchen. Low voices and the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing with the particular energy of people looking for something and not finding it. She stopped at the hallway entrance and looked through the doorway. 6 men, all in the dark clothes they wore when they were working. One of them had a bandage wrapped around his forearm that was slightly too small for the wound it was covering. She could see the edge of it darkening. Another had a split in his lower lip that he kept touching with 2 fingers and then stopping because it hurt. They were opening cabinets and looking at what was inside without taking anything, the way people do when they're hungry but too tired to figure out how to solve it. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been older than 23, sat down on the floor with his back against the cabinet and put his head back against the wood and closed his eyes. Not sleeping, just stopping. Amara looked at them for a moment. Then she went to the pantry. She knew what was in there because in the weeks of enforced uselessness she'd spent in this house, she'd quietly learned every room, not intrusively, just the way she'd always done things, by paying attention to what was around her. She knew the pantry held canned stock and dried aromatics and rice and flour and a half jar of gochujang that the professional chefs used for one specific dish and otherwise left alone. She knew there were eggs. She knew where the knives were. She tied the apron on and didn't say anything to the men in the kitchen. She just turned on the low light over the range and started. The young man on the floor opened his eyes after a while and watched her without speaking. One by one, the others stopped moving around and stood still. She could feel them watching her the way exhausted people watch something that doesn't require them to do anything. With a grateful kind of attention, the kind that doesn't expect to have to respond. She made rice first because rice was the foundation. Then the broth from stock and ginger and a few things she found in the gochujang, careful with it, letting it open in the oil before anything else went in. She made a quick egg dish on the side, fried and then finished in the pan with a little of the broth. She sliced what bread was left in the cooling rack from that afternoon's prep. She set everything out on the prep counter without calling anyone over. The young man on the floor got up first. He took a bowl and looked at it like he hadn't decided yet whether to say thank you. He didn't. He just ate. The man with the bandaged arm ate standing up and then sat down and ate the rest. Nobody talked. The kitchen was quiet except for the sounds of people eating with genuine hunger, which is its own particular kind of sound. Purposeful, slightly urgent, unself-conscious. She cleaned the range while they ate. She didn't watch them. Her grandfather had taught her that too, that feeding people was not a performance you required them to acknowledge. You fed them. They ate. That was the completion. One of the men, older, with a thick neck and the kind of posture that suggested a long history of having to be ready to use his body fast, set his empty bowl down and looked at her. "What did you put in the broth?" he asked. His accent was Korean, his English direct and unhurried. "Ginger," she said, "garlic, the paste, stock, not much else." He looked at the bowl. "My mother made something like this." She didn't respond to that. She didn't know what to say to it that wouldn't ruin it. He nodded once, like he was confirming something to himself, and left the kitchen. The others followed. The young man was last. He paused at the door and looked back at her. Not long, just a second, and then he was gone. She stood in the quiet kitchen and looked at the empty bowls. She washed them. She put them away. She went upstairs. She lay in her bed in the dark and felt, for the first time since she'd come to this house, like herself. She didn't tell anyone what she'd done that night. She didn't need to, because 3 nights later, there were 11 of them. Not the same 6. Some of those faces returned, but there were new ones too. She looked up from the range at 1:30 a.m., and there were 11 men in the service kitchen, standing with the slightly uncertain energy of people who had heard something secondhand and weren't entirely sure of the protocol. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at what was in the pantry and started cooking. The week after that, it was 19. By the end of the second month, she'd started planning. She would make notes in the afternoon, not in the recipe journals, those were her grandfather's, she didn't want to mark them, but on plain paper, working out what she'd need, what would go furthest, what would work for men who'd been working physical, dangerous hours and needed more than elegance. She found a small notebook in a supply closet that nobody was using, and she started keeping track of things. Who ate what? Who had trouble with spice? Who always took 2 bowls of broth but barely touched the rice? Who ate fast because they were still tense, and who ate slowly because they'd finally unwound? She learned their names, all of them. Not by asking directly. She knew better than to make men in this organization feel cataloged. She learned the way her grandfather had always said to learn people, by listening when they talked around her rather than at her, by watching what they reached for first, by remembering what they'd mentioned once in passing that nobody else probably remembered at all. Park Sung-jin, the security chief with the scar, mentioned once while refilling his bowl that his youngest daughter had started school. She remembered. Do Kwang-soo, the oldest one, the one who'd eventually say the thing to Jae-hyun that would stop the room cold. Do ate everything but always left the green onion to the side of the bowl without eating it. She stopped putting green onion in his portion. He never said anything about it. But the next time she made broth, he sat down before anyone else, and he was already there when she started, just sitting quietly, which was Do's version of saying something. She made his broth first. The men brought things. Not as payment. She never would have accepted that framing, and they seemed to understand. But things appeared in the service kitchen that hadn't been there before. Better knives, larger pots, a proper ladle instead of the bent one she'd been using. Fresh produce that wasn't on any of the household's official shopping lists. She didn't ask where any of it came from, she used it. What she didn't know, and couldn't see, was that the thing she was building in that kitchen was already larger than the kitchen. She thought she was feeding people. She was doing that. But the men who came for the midnight meals brought what they'd eaten and what they'd felt back into their days with them. And those days were organized around a world that ran on suspicion and hierarchy and the constant management of threat. And something that moved differently than suspicion. Something that remembered you, that knew you didn't eat green onion, that made you feel like a person who had a history worth knowing, moved through that world like a different kind of current entirely. She didn't see it yet. She would. But the night Jae-hyun found them, the night he walked in and the room silenced, and Do Kwang-soo said what he said, and then nobody could breathe. Amara was already standing in the middle of something much larger than a kitchen. She just didn't know yet that the man in the doorway was about to start figuring that out too. And that when he did, everything in the Kang Empire was going to have to reckon with what one woman with a pot and a notebook and her dead grandfather's recipes had already quietly changed. Jae-hyun didn't sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the window of his study on the 3rd floor and looked at the grounds below and thought about a room full of his men going quiet all at once. He thought about Chul laughing in the corridor with his jacket off. He thought about Do Kwang-soo, 61 years old, 3 wars behind him, a man who communicated exclusively in economy, saying what he said in front of 50 other people without flinching. He thought about the way Amara had looked at him from across the kitchen, not afraid, not apologetic, just waiting. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey and didn't drink it. He set the glass on the desk and looked at it. Outside, the guards moved along the tree line on their scheduled rotation, their flashlight beams cutting low across the wet grass. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. His house, his grounds, his men running their routes on time. And somewhere below him, in a service kitchen he had walked past 1,000 times without looking at, his wife had been feeding his entire organization for months without his knowledge. He picked up the whiskey and drank it in one pull and set the glass down hard. In the morning, he didn't mention it. He came down to the main dining room at 7, as he always did, and ate breakfast alone at one end of the long table while his morning briefing was delivered by his operations manager, Lee Byung-hoon, a thin, precise man who communicated efficiently and without decoration. 2 delivery routes needed rerouting due to a surveillance concern in the port district. A meeting with the Castellano lawyers had been pushed to Thursday. One of the warehouse managers in the valley had a problem that required personal attention. Jae-hyun listened. He asked the questions he needed to ask. He gave the directives that needed giving. His coffee went cold, and he drank it cold because he didn't notice. Lee finished and waited the way he always waited for dismissal or follow-up. Jae-hyun said, "The men who came back injured 2 nights ago from the harbor operation. Who was on that crew?" Lee checked his tablet. Sung-jin led it, 8 men. 3 had minor injuries. They were cleared by the house physician by midnight. And after that, a slight pause. Lee was not a man who paused. After clearance, they were released to quarters, sir. Jae-hyun looked at him. Lee kept his face arranged correctly. I believe some of them may have remained in the East Wing before retiring. You believe? Yes, sir. Jae-hyun looked at his cold coffee. Get me Sung-jin. Park Sung-jin came into the study 12 minutes later and stood with his hands clasped in front of him and his chin level. The scar on his face caught the morning light from the east window and looked, as it always did, like a sentence in a language that had only one word. Jae-hyun didn't offer him a seat. How long? Sung-jin didn't pretend to need clarification. 4 months, sir. Approximately. Approximately. The first time was not organized. Some of the men from the harbor rotation in March came back late, and the kitchen was closed. Mrs. Kang, she was awake. She cooked for them. Word passed. It became a pattern. A pattern. Jae-hyun repeated the word without inflection, which was more effective than shouting it. You allowed a pattern to develop inside this house for 4 months. I didn't stop it, sir. No. Why? Sung-jin was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone constructing a lie. The quiet of someone deciding how much of the true thing to say. Because the men were different after. The atmosphere in the organization changed. People were working better together, fewer conflicts between crews. I watched it happen, and I made a judgment that it was not harmful to operations. He looked at Jae-hyun directly. I should have reported it. That was my failure, and I accept it. Jae-hyun stood up from his desk and walked to the window. He stood with his back to Sung-jin and looked out at the grounds below. A long silence opened up between them, the kind that had weight that pressed down on the person standing in the room who wasn't in control of when it ended. The injured man, Jae-hyun said finally. The young one. Ryu something. Ryu Tae-young, 22. His arm was bandaged wrong. The dressing was wrong for the wound. A pause. Yes, sir. Field dressing. The physician corrected it later. Mrs. Kang noticed before the physician. Another pause, slightly longer. I believe she did, sir. Jae-hyun turned from the window. He looked at Sung-jin the way he looked at situations he was still mapping. Not with anger, not yet, but with the full weight of his attention, which was its own kind of pressure. You are dismissed, he said. Don't let me find out there are other things in this house I don't know about. Sung-jin nodded once, turned precisely, and left. Jae-hyun stood alone in the study and thought about a 22-year-old with a badly wrapped arm who had sat down on the floor of a dark kitchen and closed his eyes. Seo Min-kyung found out about the kitchen gatherings 3 days after Jae-hyun did, which meant she found out from a source Jae-hyun hadn't locked down, which meant the information had been moving through the household staff on a current he hadn't fully mapped yet. That irritated him. But it was Min-kyung's response that he had to manage now. She came to him in the afternoon, which was already a signal. Min-kyung came to him in the morning when things were administrative, in the evening when things were social, and in the afternoon only when she was too agitated to wait. She sat across from his desk with her back straight and her hands folded on her knee, and she began with a tone that was very carefully arranged to sound calm. I thought you should know what I've discovered about the situation in the East Kitchen. I already know, he said. She absorbed that. I see. Then you know that it's been going on for months, that your wife has essentially been running an informal canteen for the organization's personnel without any authorization, without any oversight, without any sanitation compliance review. Min-kyung. And without any consideration for what it communicates to the men about the hierarchy of this household. When the wife of the organization's leader is serving food to low-level drivers and mechanics at 2 in the morning, what is that? Enough. She stopped, her jaw set. I'm handling it, he said. How? He looked at her with the particular quality of stillness that meant the conversation was over. Min Kyung had known him since he was 9 years old. She knew what that stillness meant. She stood, smoothed her jacket, and left the room without saying anything else. But her face, in the moment before she turned, that was a different sentence entirely. That was a woman who had decided that if he wasn't going to handle it, she was going to handle it herself. He should have said something more definitive in that moment. He knew it, sitting there afterward. He should have made it explicit. He didn't, because part of him was still working out exactly what he thought. And he didn't like operating without clarity, and so he chose silence and told himself it was control when maybe it was something else. Min Kyung moved faster than he expected. She started with the household budget. It took her less than a day to pull the kitchen supply logs and identify the discrepancies. Fresh ingredients that weren't accounted for in the professional chef team's orders, quantities of staples that were being depleted faster than the household's official meals could explain. She brought the numbers to the household administrator and asked pointed questions in the particular tone she used when she already knew the answers and was building a case rather than seeking information. Then she went to the staff. She didn't do it obviously. She was too skilled for obvious. She had conversations with the head housekeeper, with 2 of the day guards, with the estate's logistics coordinator, that were ostensibly about other things, but that left the people she spoke with the clear impression that the kitchen situation was under scrutiny and that anyone associated with it should be considering their position carefully. The effect was immediate and corrosive. The kitchen staff, who had been silently enabling Amara's late-night supply draws by simply not asking questions, became suddenly very interested in asking questions. 2 of the day guards who had covered for men arriving late at the East Corridor started logging arrival times with a new precision. The comfortable invisibility that had protected the midnight meals for 4 months began to develop gaps. Amara noticed on the 5th night after Jae-hyun's visit to the kitchen, when only 11 men came instead of the usual 30 or more. She didn't say anything. She cooked for 11 and set everything out and watched the space around the table that was usually full. Do Kwang-soo came that night. He ate slowly, which was normal, but he didn't look up from his bowl very much, which wasn't. Near the end, when most of the others had left, he set down his spoon and looked at the middle of the table. "People are being careful," he said. It wasn't directed at her specifically. It was directed at the air. "I noticed," she said. "It's not the boss." He said it with certainty. He would have shut it down directly. He doesn't do indirect. She didn't respond to that. She started stacking bowls. "Min Kyung," he said. Not a question. She kept stacking bowls. Do pushed himself up from the table with his hands and stood. He was quiet for a moment. "Be careful what you do next," he said, and then he left. She stood alone in the kitchen with a stack of bowls and thought about what doing nothing looked like and what it cost and whether she'd been through enough in the past 7 months to know the difference between choosing patience and choosing to disappear. She went to Min Kyung herself. 2 days later, in the morning, before anything else could move. She found her in the household office on the 2nd floor, where Min Kyung spent her mornings reviewing the estate's operations with the same concentrated energy a general brings to maps. Min Kyung looked up when Amara appeared in the doorway, and her expression went through 3 things in very fast succession: surprise, calculation, and then the elegant neutral it always settled on when it needed to. Amara. Polite. Even warm. "I didn't expect you this morning." "I know." Amara stepped into the office and closed the door behind her. She didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of the room with her hands at her sides. "I wanted to talk to you directly." "Of course." Min Kyung set down her pen. "Please. What's on your mind?" Amara looked at her. She had thought about how to do this for 2 days, and she had decided there was no technique. "You just said it." "The kitchen. What I've been doing with the men. I know you know. I know you're concerned about it." Min Kyung's face arranged itself into something that was almost concern. "I'm not concerned, exactly. I simply think there are considerations around the appropriate role of—" "They were hungry," Amara said. Min Kyung paused. "After the harbor operation, they came back injured at 2 in the morning, and the kitchen was closed, and they were hungry and exhausted. I cooked for them, and then other people needed to eat, and I cooked for them. That's what happened. I understand the impulse, Min Kyung said carefully. But you have to see how it looks. The wife of the organization's leader, serving food to employees at 2 in the morning. Unsupervised, unauthorized. It undermines. What does it undermine? Min Kyung looked at her. The warmth in her voice shifted slightly, not disappearing, just thinning over whatever was underneath. The order of things, the hierarchy. These men need to understand clearly where authority comes from in this organization. When you create this kind of informal arrangement, it blurs things. It creates confusion about what the Kang family represents. Amara looked at her for a long time. The men aren't confused, she said. You don't know these men the way I do. I know what they eat. I know which of them has a daughter who just started school. I know that Ryu Tae-yang had a wound that needed better dressing than he got in the field, and I know he would not have asked anyone for help on his own. She paused. I'm not saying I know them the way you do. I'm saying I know things. Something shifted in Min Kyung's face. Not anger, not exactly. Something that was older than anger, more settled into the bone. You've been here 7 months, she said. This organization has been running for 30 years. What you've built in that kitchen is not stability. It is a complication. Okay, Amara said. Min Kyung waited. Okay? Okay. You think it's a complication. I hear you. Amara moved toward the door. I'm not going to fight you about it. I just wanted to say it directly, to your face, instead of letting it happen around us. She put her hand on the door. Behind her, Min Kyung's voice came out with a different texture than before, still controlled, but with something sharp inside it. You don't belong in this world, Amara. That is not an insult. It is simply true. This life requires a specific kind of hardness. You are kind. Kindness doesn't survive here. Amara stopped with her hand on the door. She didn't turn around. Plenty of things survive here that shouldn't, she said, and she opened the door and walked out. She kept her face even until she got to the east stairwell. She put her hand against the wall and stood still for a moment and let her chest do what it needed to do, and then she breathed through it, and she straightened up, and she went back to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her grandfather's journals stacked on the nightstand, and she thought about what her grandfather used to say when someone made him feel small. He would just say, I know who I am. Not with defiance, just with the flat, immovable certainty of someone who had already had the argument with themselves and settled it. She picked up the journal on top and opened it to the middle and looked at his handwriting. She knew who she was, but that night, for the first time, she didn't go to the kitchen. The next night, she didn't go either. By the third night, the men knew. Nobody announced it. Nobody sent a message. Do Kwang Soo walked past the east corridor at 1 a.m., and the light under the service kitchen door was off, and that was the announcement. He kept walking. He went to his quarters and sat on the edge of his cot and stared at the floor. Ryu Tae-yang, the youngest one, found out from a driver named Cho, who found out from one of the day guards who had noticed the kitchen going dark 2 nights running. Tae-yang didn't say anything. He ate his dinner from the main kitchen the next evening. The formal preparation, the portion plate, the food that was exactly as good as it was supposed to be, and had nothing in it that remembered him. And he finished it and put the plate in the collection area and walked back to the barracks hall. He sat on his bunk and looked at his hands. The men didn't talk about it with each other. Not directly. But the mansion had a feeling now that it hadn't had before. Not the feeling it used to have before the kitchen nights, but a new and worse feeling, the feeling of having known something warm and now knowing its absence. Before Amara, the cold was just the temperature. Now it was a subtraction. Sungjin noticed it in the operations briefings. Men were technically compliant, everything on time, everything properly executed. But the texture was wrong. The small marginal cooperation that happens when people actually like being around each other, the way one crew will absorb slack for another crew without being asked, the way veterans bring new recruits along without being directed, that had thinned out. Not gone. Thinned. He logged it in his personal notes but said nothing to Jae-hyun. He was still carrying his own weight from the confession about the kitchen. He didn't have the standing to walk back in there and say, "The thing I admitted to you and took blame for turning out to be the thing holding this organization together, and now that it's stopped, I need you to address it." He couldn't say that, so he wrote it in his notes at night and watched the hallways and said nothing. Jae-hyun noticed too. He noticed the way he always noticed things, obliquely first, through accumulation. A briefing that should have taken 20 minutes took 35, because two crew leads had a miscommunication about a handoff point that 3 months ago they would have resolved before it reached the briefing. A shipment coordination issue that was minor, but shouldn't have been a surprise, wasn't flagged until it was already a minor problem rather than a preventable one. The small daily machinery of the organization was running on slightly more friction than it should. He pulled Byung-hoon aside after the Thursday briefing. "The men, what's the mood?" Byung-hoon considered the question with the care he gave everything. "Functional," he said. "Efficient. But," a pause. "Quieter, sir." Jae-hyun looked at him. "Quieter." "Yes." Jae-hyun dismissed him and went to the window of his office and stood there looking at the grounds and thought about quiet and what it was the absence of. Chubby. He went to Amara's room that evening. He didn't announce it. He didn't send anyone ahead. He walked down the east hall and knocked on the door of her room and waited. She opened it after a moment. She was wearing plain clothes, dark trousers and a fitted top, and her hair was pulled back and she had a journal in her hand with her thumb holding a page. She looked at him and didn't say anything, which was not quite surprise and not quite its absence, just attention. He stood in the doorway. He was not entirely sure why he had come, which was a situation he handled poorly. "The kitchen," he said. She waited. "Why did you stop?" It wasn't quite a question. She heard the shape of it anyway. She stepped back from the door. Not an invitation exactly, but not its refusal. And he came inside and stood near the door. The room was spare in its personal items, which he noticed now in a way he hadn't when he'd briefly seen it months ago during the initial tour of the estate. Her things were organized, but they were few, and what there was of them was functional or old. The journals on the nightstand, a small framed photograph he couldn't see clearly from where he stood. "I was told it was a complication," she said. He looked at her. "By who?" She closed the journal in her hand. "You know by who." He did. He looked at the floor for a moment, which was not something he typically did. "Min Kyung doesn't speak for me." "I know that." "Then why?" Amara looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately read, which was, in itself, unusual. He could read most people. "Because I was tired," she said, "and because I didn't want to keep doing something that I didn't know whether you wanted me to do or not. And you didn't tell me, so I stopped." The simplicity of it landed without decoration. She wasn't accusing him, she was just telling him what happened, with the same directness she'd used in Min Kyung's office, except this version was quieter and therefore harder to stand in front of. He said, "I didn't tell you to stop. You didn't tell me anything." Another simple sentence. Also true. He stood with it. "The men are different," he said finally, "since you stopped." She looked at him. "I know. You noticed. They came for weeks and then they stopped coming, and I'm not in a room with them directly, but yes, I know. I can feel it in the house." He looked at her. This woman he had exchanged fewer than 50 real conversations with in 7 months of living in the same building. This woman his men called Mama. This woman who had learned Do Kwang Soo didn't eat green onion and had quietly adjusted without making it into anything. And he felt the particular discomfort of someone encountering a gap between what they assumed and what was true. He had assumed she was peripheral. He had organized the entire structure of how he thought about her around that assumption. He was standing in her room at 8 p.m. on a Thursday because his organization was running on more friction than it should be, and the only variable that had changed was the light under the service kitchen door going dark, and he needed to be honest enough with himself to say what that meant. He said, "I need you to go back." Amara was quiet for a moment. Her expression didn't move in the way he expected. Not relief, not vindication. She just looked at him steadily. Jae-hyun. She used his name directly for the first time since the estate tour 7 months ago. If I go back and Min Kyung decides to make it a problem again, I'll handle Min Kyung. You said that already, before this happened. The words were precise and they were fair, and he had nothing to put against them because she was correct. He had told Sung Jin he was handling it, and he had told Min Kyung he was handling it, and he had handled neither, and his wife had walked into the middle of a situation he left unresolved and had paid for his silence with 3 nights of staring at the journal on her nightstand while the men in the barracks sat on their bunks and felt the subtraction. He stood in her room and held that. I will handle it, he said. This time, I mean it as a directive and not a figure of speech. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. He turned to leave. He was at the door when she said quietly behind him, They need more than food, you know. They need to feel like someone knows they exist. He stopped with his hand on the doorframe. I know you know that, she said. You built all of this on knowing exactly who everyone is and what they need. But knowing someone's weakness isn't the same as knowing them. He didn't turn around. He stood in the doorframe for a moment with the corridor light behind him. Then he walked out and pulled the door shut quietly behind him. He went back to his study and sat at his desk in the dark. He didn't turn the light on for a long time. And 2 floors down, in the east wing, Seo Min Kyung sat in the household office with a page of supply logs on the desk in front of her and a phone in her hand, and she made a call that she had been preparing to make for 3 days, to a person inside the Kang organization who owed her considerably more than they knew. It was a call that was going to make the kitchen the least of anyone's problems. The call Min Kyung made that night lasted 11 minutes. Jae-hyun found out about it 4 days later, which meant it had already done what it was designed to do before he knew it existed. That was the thing about damage that moved through channels he didn't monitor. By the time it surfaced, it wasn't damage anymore. It was consequence. The person Min Kyung called was Han Seok-won. Han was 44, the Kang organization's liaison to 3 separate legal entities that handled the laundering architecture for the West Coast operation. He was not a violent man. He had soft hands and a careful way of speaking, and he wore glasses he didn't need because he decided at 32 that they made him look more like a lawyer and less like what he actually was. He had been with the organization for 16 years, and in that time he had never once been asked to do anything that required him to be in the same room as Blood. He owed Min Kyung a favor that was 11 years old and large enough that neither of them had ever spoken about it directly. They didn't need to. The favor sat between them in every interaction they'd had since, a silent accounting that both parties understood perfectly. When she called, she didn't ask him for anything dramatic. She simply told him that there was a situation inside the household that was creating instability, and that she thought certain members of the organization's senior leadership, people who had the boss's ear in a way that she, as a household manager, did not, might benefit from understanding the nature of the situation more clearly. Han listened. He said he understood. He thanked her for the information. What Min Kyung did not tell him, what she perhaps did not fully understand herself, was that Han Seok-won had his own reasons for wanting instability inside the Kang household, reasons that had nothing to do with kitchen gatherings or a plus-size black woman with a ladle, reasons that were considerably older and considerably larger than anything she was trying to accomplish. She gave him a match. She didn't know he was already standing in a room full of accelerant. The first sign came through Byung-hoon on a Monday morning. He arrived at the briefing room 4 minutes early, which was normal, and set his materials on the table, which was normal. But when Jae-hyun came in and looked at him, he saw something in Byung-hoon's face that was not normal. Byung-hoon's face was arranged correctly. His posture was correct. But there was a quality in his stillness that was managed rather than natural, the way a person holds their expression when they are working to maintain it. Jae-hyun sat down. What? Byung-hoon set a single sheet of paper on the table and slid it across. It was a financial summary, 2 pages condensed into one, with 3 figures circled in red at the bottom. Jae-hyun looked at it. He looked at it for long enough that the room got very quiet. When did this come in? He said. Last night, through the Castellano audit channel. Their accounting team flagged it as a discrepancy in the quarterly reconciliation and sent it for our review. A pause. It's not a discrepancy. No, Jae-hyun said. It's not. The numbers on the page represented 3 transfers, small, individually unremarkable, the kind of transfers that move through the organization's financial infrastructure daily without comment. But the pattern of their timing, their destination routing, and the specific account structures they'd passed through told a different story when you looked at all three together. Someone had been moving money out of the West Coast laundering architecture through a tertiary channel that wasn't on any of the organization's official maps. Not a lot of money. Not yet. But enough to establish the channel, enough to test it, enough to prove it worked. The account the transfers had been routed through, ultimately, after passing through 4 intermediate structures, belonged to a holding entity that Jae-hyun recognized. He had authorized that entity himself 8 years ago for a specific purpose that had since concluded. It should have been dormant. Nobody should have known it existed except the 3 people who were present when it was created. One of those people was Byung-hoon. One was a lawyer who had since retired to Seoul. The third was Han Seok-won. Jae-hyun set the paper down on the table and looked at it with both hands flat beside it. He breathed in through his nose and out slowly. The room was very quiet. "Where's Han?" he said. "At the Century City office. He has a meeting with the Belmont Group lawyers at 10. Jae-hyun looked at the time. It was 8:47. "Pull him out of it, estate." They brought Han to the estate at 10:23. He came in through the main entrance, which was deliberate. Jae-hyun wanted him to walk the full length of the entrance corridor, past the guards who were posted there, and who all knew Han by face, so that by the time he reached the study, he had had the experience of understanding that the people who surrounded him on all sides were not his people. They had never been his people. They were patient and professional, and they served the man he was about to sit across from. Han came in with his hands in his pockets and his face arranged in the expression of a man who is mildly inconvenienced by an interruption to a busy morning. He sat in the chair across from Jae-hyun's desk and adjusted his glasses. "I hope this is urgent," he said. "The Belmont meeting took 6 weeks to schedule." Jae-hyun put the financial summary on the desk and turned it to face Han. Han looked at it. His face didn't move. That was the tell. Not a flinch or a blanch, but the absolute absence of any reaction whatsoever, which is what a face does when it has already rehearsed the moment of seeing something and has settled on stillness as the chosen performance. "Interesting," Han said. "The account," Jae-hyun said. "Explain how it's active." "I'd need to look into it. There may be a clerical—" "Han." The name landed flat. "I need you to understand what's happening right now. I am asking you one time. Explain how that account is active." Han took his glasses off and looked at them and put them back on. A gesture that meant nothing and was designed to occupy a second and a half of time. Jae-hyun had seen that gesture before, in rooms across lacquered tables, in negotiations, in conversations where someone was buying the half-second they needed to decide between two versions of a story. "There are people," Han said carefully, "who are concerned about the direction of the organization." Jae-hyun said nothing. Long-term people. People who have served the Kong structure for a very long time and who have certain reservations about recent developments, about stability, about decisions being made at the household level that affect the organization's cohesion. He paused. "They're not enemies. They're concerned parties." "Who called you?" Jae-hyun said. Han's expression didn't shift. "I received many calls." "Who called you 4 days ago and told you something about my household?" The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Han straightened slightly in his chair, which was the posture of a man who has decided that the version of events he was going to offer is the final one. "Min Kyung called me. She expressed concerns about your wife's influence over the organization's personnel. She felt it was creating a dynamic that undermined the structure." He looked at Jae-hyun directly. "She wasn't wrong about the concern. She was simply speaking to the wrong person about it. And you decided to move money." "I decided to take a precautionary measure to establish an exit route for assets in the event that the organization's internal stability continued to deteriorate. I have a fiduciary responsibility." Jae-hyun stood up. Han stopped speaking. Jae-hyun walked around the desk slowly and stood in front of Han's chair and looked down at him. He was not a physically imposing man in the way that Sung-jin or Do were imposing. He was lean and contained, and his violence, when it existed, was a function of precision rather than mass. He looked at Han the way you look at a mechanism that has failed, not with rage, but with the clinical attention of someone deciding what to do with a broken thing. "A fiduciary responsibility," he said. To whom? Han said nothing. To the organization you were skimming. To the people who are going to have a conversation with you in a room that is not this room. To your family. He paused on the word family, not for emphasis, but because the word had a specific meaning in this context and both of them knew it. Fiduciary responsibility. To whom, Han? Han took his glasses off again. This time he held them in his lap and looked at the floor. The performance was over. What was left underneath it was something much smaller. A man who had made a calculation 16 years ago about what kind of safety this life provided and was now sitting in a chair understanding that the calculation had been wrong for at least the last 4 days. It wasn't just the money, Han said quietly. There are people talking about a transition, a restructuring, about whether the current leadership is equipped to handle what's coming. The pressure from the federals in the next 18 months is going to be significant. There are people who think, stop talking about other people, Jae-hyun said. You're the person in the chair. Han closed his mouth. Jae-hyun stepped back. He called for Sung-jin with 2 words through the study door and stood with his back to Han and looked at the window while Sung-jin came in and took Han out. Han didn't speak again. He walked out of the study with his glasses in his hand and his face finally doing what faces do when the performance ends. Going slack, going afraid, going very old, very fast. Jae-hyun stood at the window and thought about the word transition. He spent the next 6 hours in controlled motion. Byung-hoon pulled the complete financial audit. 3 other transfers surfaced. Same pattern, older, testing the channel's capacity in increments over 14 months. The total was significant, but the money was not in the end the most significant thing. The most significant thing was the word Han had used. Transition. And the phrase that followed it, people talking, plural. Jae-hyun had Byung-hoon build a communication map. Every contact Han had been in substantive touch with over the past 90 days, cross-referenced against organizational rank and financial access. It took 2 hours. When Byung-hoon set the map on the desk, Jae-hyun looked at it for a long time without speaking. 4 names on the map were senior. 2 were in legal infrastructure, like Han. 1 was a logistics coordinator who controlled movement through the port of Long Beach. The 4th was a man named Cha Dong-hyun, who ran the organization's Northern California operations out of a legitimate import business in Oakland. Cha Dong-hyun had been with the Kong organization for 22 years. He had worked under Jae-hyun's father. He had stood at the graveside when the old man died and wept, or performed weeping, the distinction now requiring revisitation, and had continued under Jae-hyun's leadership with the apparent loyalty of someone who understood that loyalty was the only currency that mattered. 22 years. Jae-hyun sat with that number for a moment. He thought about what 22 years meant, the accumulation of trust, the specific weight of it, the way it operated not as a single event, but as 1,000 small confirmations that compounded over time into something you stopped actively verifying because verification stopped feeling necessary. He had stopped verifying Cha Dong-hyun. He called Sung-jin back in. He told him what he needed done about Cha and the others. Sung-jin listened, took his notes in his head as he always did, and left without asking questions. That was one of Sung-jin's virtues. He understood when the situation required him to be a mechanism and not a counsel. Jae-hyun sat alone in the study. The light outside had shifted to late afternoon gold, the kind of light that made the grounds look like a painting of somewhere peaceful. He had built this estate. He had built the organization that filled it. He had structured 31 years of carefully managed power into an architecture that was supposed to be, if not invulnerable, at least comprehensible. A structure where the failure points were known and monitored and controlled. He had 22 years with Cha Dong-hyun and hadn't seen it. He had 7 months with Amara and hadn't seen that either. 2 different kinds of blindness. He sat in the late afternoon light and tried to understand what they had in common. Min Kyung came to him at 6. She didn't know yet about Han's full confession, about the communication map, about Cha. She knew she had made a call, and she had been waiting 4 days for some consequence to materialize, and nothing visible had materialized, and so she had convinced herself, the way intelligent people sometimes convince themselves of the convenient thing. that the call had been discreet and contained and was now behind her. She came in with the composed energy of someone managing guilt by staying in motion. She sat. She asked if he had a moment. He said he did, which was not true but was useful. She began with the household budget reconciliation. She was 3 minutes into it before he said, Han Seok-won. She stopped. You called him 4 days ago, after you left this office. Her face did something very small and very fast, a compression, a recalibration, and then it returned to neutral. But neutral now had a different quality. It had the quality of a person who has just understood that the conversation they thought they were in is not the conversation that is actually happening. I expressed some concerns to him about household stability, she said carefully. Han is currently explaining to Sungjin exactly how long he has been moving money through a channel that does not exist on any of our financial maps. He watched her face. He's also explaining who he has been in contact with, who shares his concerns about leadership, who uses words like transition. Min Kyung sat very still. You gave him the opening, Jae-hyun said. You called him and told him the house was unstable, and you gave him a reason and a window, and he walked through it. He looked at her without any particular expression. Did you know what he was doing? The silence lasted a long time. Her hands, which were always still, were still. But the quality of the stillness was wrong. It was held, not natural. No, she said. I did not know. He looked at her. I called him because I was concerned, she said, and the precision broke slightly, the voice going fractionally raw underneath the surface. About the organization, about what I was seeing inside this house. A woman who had been here 7 months turning your entire personnel structure into her personal social project. I called because I was worried, Jae-hyun, not because I wanted... She stopped. She reset. I did not know what Han was doing. No, he said. I believe you. He said it without warmth. You called him because you wanted leverage you didn't have to earn. Because I wasn't moving fast enough on something that scared you. And you gave information about instability inside this house to a man who turned out to be actively working to accelerate that instability. He paused. You didn't know, but you also didn't ask. Min Kyung looked at him. For the first time in the 12 years she had managed this household, she looked at him without the architecture of authority she normally wore. Underneath it, she was just a woman who was 63 and afraid, and had made a significant miscalculation about who she was calling and why. What happens now? She said. Now, he said. I deal with the consequences of your call and my silence, and Han's greed, and Cha Dong-hyun's 22-year performance of loyalty. He stood. And you will not take any action regarding the household, regarding my wife, regarding any personnel matter, without my direct authorization. Not a phone call, not a conversation, nothing. She nodded. It was a small movement. It cost her something. He walked to the door. Then he stopped. Without turning. She was feeding my men because they were hungry and nobody else was paying attention. That is not a complication. That is the only thing in this house that has been working correctly. He left. Min Kyung sat in the study alone and looked at the space in front of her. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the afternoon gold had gone to gray, and the grounds below were moving into the particular stillness of early evening when the day shift transitions to the night watch. She sat there for a long time. The information about Cha Dong-hyun arrived at 9 p.m. through a source Jae-hyun had embedded in the Oakland operation 3 years ago, a contingency measure he had established against a scenario he'd considered unlikely enough that he'd almost dismantled it twice. He hadn't dismantled it. That was the thing about good operational habits. You maintained them through the years when you didn't need them so that they existed in the years when you did. What the source told him was worse than the financial map suggested. Cha had been in contact with the Tren organization. Not the careful, formalized contact of the meeting 3 weeks ago at the lacquered table. Old contact. Quiet contact. A channel that had been running parallel to the Kang-Trin relationship for at least 2 years, managed through a legitimate restaurant supply business in the Richmond district that neither organization officially acknowledged. The Trin family had been doing business with Cha Dong-hyun directly, independent of the Kang structure, in exchange for information about the Kang organization's West Coast operations. For 2 years. Jae-hyun read the message twice. He set his phone down on the desk. He sat in the chair and breathed. His chest was very even. His hands were still. He was good when the actual catastrophe arrived, at the containment of immediate response. He had learned it young, in rooms with his father, in situations that required him to be the one person who didn't react while everyone else was reacting. He sat still and thought about what Cha had given the Trin organization over 2 years. Roots, personnel, timing of operations, the structural vulnerabilities of the West Coast architecture. The things you would need to know if you were planning to absorb an organization rather than negotiate with it. The meeting 3 weeks ago, the 3 hours at the lacquered table, the low voices, the tea nobody drank. He'd walked into that meeting knowing the Trin organization had intelligence about his operation that was sharper than it should have been. He'd attributed it to their own sources. He had been complimenting them, in his private assessment, on the quality of their information network. Their information network was Cha Dong-hyun, 22 years in. He picked up the phone and called Sung-jin. Sung-jin answered on the first ring, which meant he was already awake and waiting, which meant he had either guessed or been told by someone downstream that the night was not finished. "Oakland," Jae-hyun said. "Yes, sir." "Tonight." "Yes, sir." He ended the call. He sat in the study for another 2 minutes. Then he stood and walked down the east corridor toward the service kitchen, which was dark, the light under the door extinguished as it had been for the past several days. He stood in front of the closed door and looked at it. He put his hand on the door and pushed it open and stood in the dark kitchen without turning the light on. It smelled still of something, faint, residual, the ghost of whatever had been cooked in here over 4 months of midnights. The pots were on the rack. The ladle was hanging on its hook. The long prep table that had been pushed together with folding tables to make one long surface was back to its original configuration, the folding tables folded and leaning against the wall. He stood in the dark kitchen and thought about 53 people going quiet all at once. He thought about 22 years. He thought about what his wife had said from across the room. Knowing someone's weakness isn't the same as knowing them. He had built an organization on knowing weaknesses. He had run 31 years of operations on the certainty that if you knew what a person needed and could not get anywhere else, you controlled them. It was a complete system. It had worked. His empire was proof that it worked. And Cha Dong-hyun had spent 22 years performing the weakness Jae-hyun expected to see, feeding him the version of loyalty that the system was designed to produce, while running a completely separate set of loyalties on a channel that Jae-hyun's system, by design, could not detect, because it moved through a frequency his system didn't monitor. Connection, not control. Actual human connection, freely given, not extracted. He stood in the dark kitchen for a moment longer. Then he turned and went back down the corridor. He stopped at the east stairwell. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked up. Amara's room was on the 3rd floor. He had come down here thinking about Cha and the operation and what needed to happen in Oakland tonight. But standing at the bottom of the stairs, he thought about something different. He thought about the fact that for 4 months, the woman at the top of these stairs had been learning the names of every person in this organization and remembering what they ate and adjusting the broth for an old man's preference for no green onion and noticing a young man's badly wrapped wound before the physician did. And he had been in this same building for all 4 of those months, and he had not known her name for what it was. She had built real loyalty in 4 months. Someone had dismantled 22 years of performed loyalty in 2. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and felt the weight of what was coming. The Oakland operation tonight, the restructuring of the financial architecture, the conversations that needed to happen with the Trin family from a position that was now compromised in ways he was still fully mapping. And underneath all of that, quieter and more persistent, the weight of a different understanding beginning to settle into place. He had been wrong about the most important thing. Not about operations, not about structure or financial architecture or the management of threat, about people, about what held people together, about what made an organization something more than a collection of controlled dependencies. He had been wrong, and the proof of his wrongness was currently sitting in the dark stairwell of his own building while his organization moved on two fronts, one visible, one that had been invisible for 2 years. And the only thing that had been genuinely building something in this house for the past 4 months was the light under a kitchen door that was now extinguished. He needed it back on. Not because his men were quieter without it, though they were. Not because the organization ran on more friction without it, though it did. But because something was happening inside the Kang Empire that had nothing to do with kitchen meals, and everything to do with what those meals represented. And Jae-hyun was standing at the bottom of the stairs, understanding for the first time that you cannot lead people you do not actually know, and that he had confused management for knowledge for 31 years, and that the woman on the third floor with her dead grandfather's journals had understood something about human beings that his entire empire had been built in deliberate ignorance of. He put his foot on the first stair. Then his phone vibrated. Sung-jin. Oakland was moving. He stood with his foot on the first stair and his phone in his hand and the weight of both things pressing on him simultaneously. The operational crisis that was already in motion, and the other thing, the quieter thing, the thing that was going to matter long after Oakland was handled, or wasn't. He answered the phone and walked back down the corridor toward the study, and behind him the stairwell stood empty and the east kitchen stayed dark. And somewhere above him, Amara Brooks Kang sat in her room with the journal open in her lap, not reading it, just holding it, listening to the sound of the house settle around her at night, while she waited to find out whether she still had a place in it. The Oakland operation took 4 hours. Jae-hyun didn't go himself. He ran it from the study, phone in one hand, the communication map spread across the desk in front of him, Byung-hoon at the side table with a second line open to the legal team in case containment required immediate documentation. Sung-jin was on the ground with 8 men. Clean, professional, the kind of operation the Kang organization had been running for 30 years. Precise entry, controlled confrontation, asset seizure, no unnecessary escalation. Cha Dong-hyun was at the Oakland warehouse when they arrived. He didn't run. That was the detail that Sung-jin reported back at 1:47 a.m., in a voice that was careful and neutral. He didn't run, sir. He was sitting at his desk. He looked like he was waiting. Jae-hyun absorbed that. A man who doesn't run when the organization comes for him is either too tired or too prepared. He told Sung-jin to find out which. While they were finding out, Jae-hyun sat at his desk and worked through the financial architecture with Byung-hoon, identifying every channel Han had touched, every account that needed to be frozen or restructured, every legal entity that would require explanation or dissolution. It was meticulous work. It was the work of dismantling something carefully so that the dismantling itself didn't create new damage. At 3 a.m., Byung-hoon left to begin the documentation process. Jae-hyun sat alone in the study. His empire had a hole in it, 2 years wide and shaped like a man he had trusted completely. The Trin organization had information about his West Coast operations that was current, detailed, and actionable. The meeting 3 weeks ago at the lacquered table, the careful negotiation, the tea nobody drank, had been a performance by people who already knew more about his position than he'd known they knew. He had sat across from them for 3 hours and conducted himself with precision and left feeling that the situation was manageable. They had been managing him. He sat in the study until 4 a.m., and then he went to bed and lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep. 3 days passed in the concentrated, airless way that days pass when a crisis is being contained. Every hour scheduled, every conversation purposeful, very little room for anything that wasn't directly connected to the immediate problem. The financial restructuring moved forward. Sung-jin returned from Oakland with a report on Cha that Jae-hyun read twice and then locked in the desk drawer. The Trin situation required a different approach now, a reassessment of every assumption from the past 2 years, which was the kind of work that made the days long and the nights longer. Amara saw almost nothing of him. She was aware of something happening. The quality of the house shifted during those 3 days in a way she could feel without being told the specifics. More guards at the main entrance. Fewer men in the corridors, which meant they were deployed rather than resident. Byung-hoon moving through the East Wing at hours he didn't typically work. She didn't ask. She understood enough about the organization's operating rules to know that asking questions about operational matters was not her role and not her right, and she had enough respect for the people running the operation to not put them in the position of having to not answer her. She went back to the kitchen on the second night. She didn't announce it. She just turned on the low-range light at 1 a.m. and started with what was in the pantry. She didn't know if anyone would come. She cooked anyway. A large pot of broth, rice, the egg dish, what bread she could make quickly. By 1:45, there were 7 men. By 2:30, there were 24. Nobody talked about Oakland. Nobody talked about Han or Cha or what was being restructured and why. They ate, and the kitchen was warm. And somebody near the back of the room said something that made 2 other people laugh, and the laugh was real. Amara stood at the range and felt the room breathe. Do Kwang-soo came in at 2:45, later than usual. He took his bowl and sat at the end of the table and ate without speaking. When he finished, he sat with the empty bowl in front of him and looked at the middle of the table. Then he said, without looking at her, "Good to have the light back." She didn't respond. She just kept cleaning the range. That was enough. The Trin organization moved on the 6th day. It came through a channel nobody anticipated, not a direct operational challenge. Nothing as uncomplicated as that. It came through a law firm. A letter delivered to the Kang organization's primary legal entity in Los Angeles, formally notifying them of a claim against the import licenses that controlled the Port of Long Beach operation. The claim was built on documentation. Detailed, specific documentation about the Kang organization's operational structure at the port. The kind of documentation that could only have come from someone with deep internal knowledge. Cha's gift to them, arriving with legal postage. Taehyun read the letter in the study with his lawyers present and his face entirely still. The letter was not, on its surface, a declaration of war. It was a legal instrument. But legal instruments, in the world the Kang organization operated in, were sometimes the most precise weapons available. They moved slowly and publicly and through channels that violence couldn't reach, and if you let them gain momentum, they became very difficult to stop. The lawyer, a Korean-American woman named Park Ji-yeon, who had represented the Kang organization for 9 years, and who did not rattle easily, looked at Jae-hyun over the top of the document and said, "They're not trying to win this in court. They're trying to make us spend the next 18 months fighting it while they absorb the port operation piece by piece. How long to challenge the underlying documentation? If we can demonstrate the source is compromised, meaning if we can put Cha's situation in front of the right people in a way that discredits the information chain, 6 to 8 weeks for the initial challenge. But the window to file the counterclaim is 14 days. 14 days. He looked at the letter. Do it. Ji-yeon nodded and left. He sat with Byung-hoon and Sung-jin for 2 hours mapping the legal strategy against the operational reality. The port operation needed to continue running without disruption during the legal challenge. Disruption would read as concession. The men assigned to Long Beach needed to maintain their positions and their routines with the same confidence they'd shown before any of this surfaced, which required that enough of them understood the situation without knowing the full details of the situation, which was a specific kind of communication that required care. Sung-jin would handle it. He always handled it. At the end of the 2 hours, when Byung-hoon had left and Sung-jin was preparing to, Jae-hyun said, "The annual gathering." Sung-jin stopped. "It's in 11 days. The annual Kong family gathering was a fixture, 40 years of organizational history, a formal event that gathered every senior figure in the organization together under one roof for an evening that was simultaneously social, political, and a demonstration of cohesion. It was, in its way, the organization's most important annual performance, the display of unity, the visible proof that the Kong structure was intact and confident and not looking over its shoulder. 11 days from now, the Trin organization's legal claim would be 4 days old and the counterclaim would be pending, and every person in the room would know that the past week had been one of the most significant crises in the organization's history. The question of whether to cancel it, delay it, modify it, these questions were sitting in the space between Jae-hyun and Sung-jin without being spoken. "We hold it," Jae-hyun said. Sung-jin nodded once. "Yes, sir." Everything is planned. Full attendance. I want every senior figure there. He said it without elaboration, and Sungjin didn't ask for any. They both understood what the gathering meant in this specific moment. You didn't cancel the demonstration of unity when unity was what was being challenged. You held it, and you made sure it was exactly what it was supposed to be. And you let the people watching you, inside the organization and outside it, draw the correct conclusion. Sungjin left. Jaehyun stayed at the desk. 11 days. Som. Min-kyung came to him the next morning. She had been quiet since their confrontation, present and functional in her household management role, conducting herself with the particular discipline of someone who has been reprimanded and is demonstrating that the reprimand was heard. She came in the morning, her appropriate hour, and she sat with her hands folded, and she looked at him with an expression that was not quite the expression she usually wore. It was something underneath that, something older and less managed. "I want to speak about the gathering," she said. "It's proceeding." "I know, I'm not here to question that." She paused. "I'm here because there are people on the guest list who are going to attend knowing what happened this week, who may be positioned to make the evening into something other than what it should be." He looked at her. "What people?" She named two. Both were senior organizational figures. Both had been on the communication map Byung-hoon built, tangential, not directly involved with Han or Cha, but adjacent in ways that suggested awareness. She named them precisely, without hedging, without the careful political architecture she usually built around uncomfortable information. She just said the names. He watched her. "Why are you telling me this?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I made a mistake, and because the gathering is more important than my position, and if those two men decide to use the evening to signal something about the organization's stability in front of a full room, the damage will outlast everything else that's happened this week." She paused. "I should have come to you directly, about Amara, about my concerns. I should have come to you and said what I thought and let you decide. I went around you instead, and what I set in motion?" She stopped. "Reset. I am telling you now because it is the only useful thing I can do." He sat with that. Min-kyung, who had run this household for 22 years with complete authority and perfect composure, sat across from him with her hands folded and her chin level, and her voice carrying the specific quality of someone who has already had the private reckoning and is now in the room for the accounting. "I know who to seat them next to," he said finally. Something moved across her face. Not relief exactly, something older. "Yes," she said. "I thought you would." She stood. She moved toward the door. Then she stopped, with her back to him, and she said, "She's good for them. The men. What she does in that kitchen." She didn't elaborate. She walked out. Jae-hyun sat in the quiet study and thought about 22 years in this house and what it did to a person. The accumulation of certainty, of authority, of a particular way of seeing a structure, and knowing your place at the center of it. And then something arrived that didn't fit the structure, and you had two choices: make room for it or remove it. Min-kyung had tried to remove it and failed, and now she was making room, and it was costing her something, and she was paying it anyway. He thought about Cha Dong-hyun sitting at his desk in Oakland, not running. Too tired, Sungjin had concluded. Not prepared. Just tired. 22 years of performing loyalty was its own kind of exhaustion. But the night of the gathering arrived cold and clear. The Kang Estate's main ballroom had been prepared with the precision of an operation. Every detail managed, every surface flawless, the long tables set with the particular elegance that communicated to the people entering that nothing here was improvised, that the Kang organization had the specific kind of confidence that expressed itself through meticulous attention to form. 114 people, senior figures, legal representatives, organizational leadership from 3 states, spouses and partners. The controlled social architecture of a world that ran parallel to the visible one, dressed in its best clothes and performing the rituals of community that powerful people perform when they want to remind each other and themselves that the structure is intact. Jae-hyun stood at the entrance and received people. He was composed, precise, correctly formal. He shook hands and exchanged the appropriate words and watched people's faces when they thought he wasn't watching. He had done this for 11 annual gatherings. He knew every face in the room and what it was covering. Amara stood beside him. This was not the arrangement from previous years. In the 2 gatherings since their marriage, she had been present but positioned slightly back, the respectful wife at a comfortable distance from the operational center of the evening. Tonight she stood directly beside him, which was where she was supposed to stand and had not previously stood, and the people coming through the entrance noticed. She wore a deep burgundy dress. She was composed in a way that had nothing performative about it. She stood the way she always stood, which was with the particular stillness of someone who doesn't need the room to confirm anything about them. She greeted people by name where she knew them, with warmth that was genuine and therefore slightly startling in a room that was running mostly on controlled courtesy. Do Kwang-soo came through the line and looked at her beside Jae-hyun, and his face did what Do's face rarely did. It moved, slightly, in the area of his eyes. He took her hand when she offered it, and held it for a moment and then released it and moved into the ballroom without saying anything. That was Do's version of a speech. The 2 names Min Kyung had given him arrived together, which told him they'd coordinated, which confirmed what her intelligence suggested about their intentions. He greeted them with complete warmth and directed them to seats at the far end of the east table, flanked on both sides by men who had been with the organization for over 15 years and whose loyalty was not a question. The 2 men smiled and thanked him and went to their seats and spent the next 3 hours behaving with perfect correctness, which was the only behavior available to them in the room they found themselves in. The dinner proceeded. The speeches were made. Byung-hoon, formal and precise, a senior lieutenant from the San Diego operation. Do, who stood for approximately 45 seconds and said 4 sentences that the room received with the kind of attention you give to someone who has never wasted words in his life. Jae-hyun spoke last, briefly, thanking the organization's people for their loyalty and their work over another year, acknowledging the challenges with the directness that his leadership style required, promising that the structure was strong and that the people in the room were the reason for its strength. He meant it. That was new. He had said versions of this speech for 11 years, and he had meant it operationally. The people in the room were genuinely assets to the structure's strength. But tonight he meant it differently, in a way that had taken 31 years in a crisis and a woman with a ladle and 4 months of midnight meals to arrive at. The people in the room were not just assets. They were the actual substance of the thing. The organization was not the financial architecture or the operational map or the legal structures. It was the people. And the people were only as strong as what connected them to each other, and what connected them had to be something more than managed dependency. He sat down, and the applause was warm, and he looked across the room at his wife. She was looking at him. She had heard the difference in the speech, and she was looking at him with an expression he was learning to read. Not surprise, not vindication, just a quiet, level attention. Seeing him. He held her gaze for a moment. Then from the other side of the ballroom, Min Kyung stood. The room quieted naturally, the way it quieted for her. 22 years of authority created its own gravity. She stood with a glass in her hand and she looked across the room with her face fully composed. And she said, "I would like to say something that is not in the program." Every head in the room turned. This was not standard. Min Kyung operated precisely within the program. "I have managed this household and this organization's domestic affairs for 22 years, she said. In that time I have believed I understood what strength looked like in this world, what loyalty looked like, what it meant to belong to the Kong family. The room was very still. I was wrong about something important. She turned her eyes toward Amara. The movement was deliberate and complete. I underestimated someone who was doing something in this house that I didn't have the capacity to understand at the time. She was not undermining our structure. She was showing us what it could actually be. Amara's hands were still on the table in front of her. Min Kyung looked at Jae-hyun. I ask your pardon publicly because my error was public in its effects. She sat down. The room remained quiet for a moment. Then Jae-hyun stood. He stood with the room's attention on him, and he looked across the ballroom, at his senior people, at the men from the midnight kitchen who were sitting at various tables in their good clothes and their careful postures, at the two names from Min Kyung's list who were being very still at the end of the east table, at Do Kwang-soo, who was looking at his hands. He looked at all of them. "Everyone who has been helped by my wife," he said. "Stand." The silence lasted 10 full seconds. Then from the middle of the room, Ryu Tae-yang, 22 years old, the youngest person in the ballroom, the man with the badly wrapped arm, who had sat on the kitchen floor with his eyes closed, stood up. He stood alone for 3 seconds. Then Park Sung-jin, who stood for no one and nothing except operational necessity, pushed his chair back and stood. Then Do. Then a driver named Cho. Then the mechanic from the Long Beach detail. Then a veteran lieutenant from the San Diego operation who had eaten midnight soup 6 times and never once acknowledged it in daylight. Then 2 of the legal team who had found their way to the service kitchen on separate occasions for reasons neither had discussed with anyone. One by one. Not all at once, not in a rush. One by one, each person making the decision individually, standing and being seen, and each one who stood made it slightly easier for the next to stand, the way a current establishes itself, and the room filled upward with people getting to their feet. 43 people. More than half the room. Amara sat and looked at them, and her face was doing something she couldn't control. Not crying, not exactly, but the expression that happens before crying when your body understands something your mind hasn't quite caught up with yet. She had fed these people because they were hungry, because her grandfather's voice in her head said, "Pay attention, make them feel remembered." She had done it in the dark, at midnight, without expectation or strategy. She had done it because it was the only thing in this house for a long time that felt like herself. She had not known it would become this. Jaehyun crossed the room toward her. The path was clear. People stepped slightly back, not dramatically, just making space, the automatic courtesy of a room that was watching something real happen between 2 people and understood instinctively to give it room. He stopped in front of her chair and looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "I thought I was building an empire," he said. His voice was quiet enough that only the people immediately around them could hear it, but the room was quiet enough that those people were listening. "I was. But I didn't know what was missing from it." She said, "You knew. You just didn't have the word for it." He reached out and took her hand where it lay on the table. His hand was dry and still, and she felt the slight callus at the base of his index finger. He held her hand and he looked at her with the face of a man who has spent 31 years building walls that were architecturally necessary and is standing in the room where one of them has come down and finding that the air is different on this side. "I was wrong about what holds people together," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not wrong about everything." "I know that too." From somewhere in the back of the ballroom, a voice, low, male, not performing anything, said, "Mama Amara." Then another. Then the room was saying it, not in unison, not choreographed, but the way a room finds its voice when it's saying something it has been wanting to say, and now has permission to say it, each voice joining the next until the sound filled the ballroom and bounced off the ceiling and came back down warm. Jaehyun stood holding his wife's hand while his organization said her name. His organization, their organization. The distinction felt for the first time like it meant something other than possession. But the 2 men at the end of the east table were not standing and were not saying the name, and they were watching Jaehyun with the carefully arranged faces of people who have just watched a room go somewhere they cannot follow, and are rapidly assessing what that means for a plan that required the room to be divided. Their plan required distance between the boss and his wife, required the men to be managed rather than connected, required an organization that ran on leverage and isolation because that was the organization they could absorb piece by piece, pressure point by pressure point, using Cha's intelligence and the Trin organization's resources and the legal claim at the port as sequential instruments in a restructuring that had been planned for longer than the past 2 years. What they were watching instead was a room that had just become, in front of their eyes, the one thing their plan could not work against. United. Genuinely, messily, imperfectly, specifically united. Not because of fear or hierarchy or managed dependency, but because a woman with her grandfather's journals had spent 4 months making 53 people feel known, and known people protect each other in ways that controlled people never will. And the two men at the end of the East table were smart enough to understand in this moment that the landscape of what they were attempting had just changed in a way that could not be undone by a legal filing or a financial channel or information delivered to a rival organization. One of them looked at the other, a half-second of eye contact. Sufficient. They both looked back at the room. Jae-hyun was still holding Amara's hand. He turned from her and looked across the ballroom, and his gaze moved with the unhurried precision that characterized everything he did, to the end of the East table. He looked at the two men who were not standing. They looked back at him. The room was still saying the name, but Jae-hyun's attention had moved, and the men who had been with him long enough to read him, Sungjin, Do, Byung-hoon, felt the shift, and their own attention followed, quietly, without display. The two men at the East table understood they were being looked at by a room that had just found its center. And Jae-hyun looked at them with the specific quality of stillness he reserved for problems he had fully mapped and was now prepared to address. And he kept his wife's hand in his, and he did not look away. He didn't move toward them that night. The two men at the East table, their names were Lim Byung-chul and Seo Jae-won, and Jae-hyun had known both of them for over a decade, had eaten at tables with them, had trusted them with operational details that required trust, sat through the remainder of the evening with the disciplined composure of people who understood that the only move available to them in that room, in that moment, was stillness. They applauded at the appropriate moments. They spoke when spoken to. They ate the dessert course with the careful attention of men concentrating very hard on appearing to concentrate on something else. Jae-hyun let them. He released Amara's hand after a moment and moved back through the room with the unhurried authority of a man who is not chasing anything because he knows exactly where everything is. He spoke to three people. He confirmed two things with Byung-hoon through 6 words exchanged near the East Corridor entrance. He returned to the head table and sat and finished his wine and listened to the room settle into the comfortable register of a gathering that has had its significant moment and is now digesting it. At 11 o'clock, when the gathering began its natural dispersal, Lim and So moved toward the exit with the slightly accelerated timing of men who had decided that leaving early was better than the alternative. They were 4 steps from the main corridor when Sungjin appeared beside them. Not blocking, just present, walking alongside as if by coincidence in the same direction. "The boss would like a word," Sungjin said quietly. "Conference room, whenever you're ready." Whenever you're ready meant now. Everyone in the organization understood the grammar. They went. Jae-hyun arrived into the conference room 7 minutes after them, which was long enough for them to sit in the room and feel the specific quality of a room they had not chosen to be in. He came in alone, closed the door, and sat across the table from both of them and looked at them with the face he used for situations he had already resolved internally and was now executing. Lim spoke first, which told Jae-hyun that Lim was the one who had convinced himself there was still a version of this conversation that went well for them. "We've been hearing things," Lim said carefully, "about the Trin situation, about the port. People are concerned." "You spoke to Han Seok-won 4 times in the past 6 weeks, Jae-hyun said. "You spoke to Cha Dong-hyun twice. One of those calls was 9 days before the Trin organization filed the legal claim." He looked at Lim. "Concern." "Yes." Lim's face went very still. Seo Jae-won put both hands flat on the table, which was not a gesture of aggression, but of someone who has decided to stop performing. He was 51, a compact man with heavy eyebrows and the specific kind of tired that accumulates over years of operating in a world that requires constant vigilance. He looked at Jae-hyun directly. "We didn't give them the documentation," he said. "That was Cha. We didn't know about the Trin channel." "I know." "Then you know we're not—" "You talked to Han about transition," Jae-hyun said. "You used that word with him. You talked about whether the current leadership was equipped for what was coming. You had those conversations while drawing salary and operating authority from this organization." He let that sit. "What you gave the Trin situation was not documentation. It was timing. You told Han the organization was unstable. Han told Cha. Cha communicated to the Trin lawyers that the moment was right." He looked at both of them. "You didn't fire the shot? You told them when to fire." The room was quiet for a long time. Theo's jaw moved. It was working something out. Not a defense, it was past that,
but something else. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of everything except what was underneath. We weren't wrong about the instability. No, Jae-hyun said. You weren't. That surprised them both. He saw it. The organization had problems, he said. Real ones. I wasn't seeing everything I should have been seeing. You identified a genuine weakness, and you made a calculation about what to do with that information, and the calculation was wrong. Not because the weakness wasn't real, but because the response you chose was to move around me instead of to me. He looked at Seo, then Lim. The same mistake as Min Kyung, different scale. Lim's hands came off the table. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked back down. 53 years old, 15 years in the organization. A man with a daughter at USC and a mortgage on a house in Pasadena that existed because of 30 years of careful positioning inside a structure he had just spent 6 weeks helping to undermine. He looked at Jae-hyun and his face did what faces do when the accounting is complete and the balance is not in your favor. What happens now? He said. Exactly what Min Kyung had said. The same 4 words, in the same register of someone who has run out of moves and is asking for the truth. Now you're going to spend the next 6 months helping Ji-yeon's team build the counterclaim, Jae-hyun said. Everything you know about what was communicated to Han and through Han to Cha and to the Trin organization, dates, words, channels, you're going to put all of it on paper, under oath if necessary, and you're going to help us close every gap they think they have. He paused. After that, your roles change, significantly. The kind of access you've had, that's finished. You'll still be in the organization because you still know things that are useful and because cutting you out entirely creates its own problems. But the access is finished. They both looked at him. That's the offer, he said. Once. Seo looked at his hands on the table. And if we don't? Jae-hyun said nothing. He just looked at Seo with the expression of a man who doesn't waste words on conclusions that are already apparent. Seo nodded. Once. Slowly, the nod of a man accepting a sentence that is lighter than the one he anticipated and heavier than the one he hoped for. Lim said, Okay. Jae-hyun stood. He left the room. In the corridor outside, he stood alone for a moment with his back against the wall and his eyes closed. His chest moved. One deliberate breath in, one out. The kind of breathing you do when the acute phase is over and your body is taking stock. His head ached faintly behind his left eye, the way it ached when he'd been in sustained concentration for too many consecutive days. He pushed off the wall and went back to the ballroom. The room was mostly empty by then, staff clearing tables, the careful systematic erasure of the evening. A few figures still in conversation near the far windows. Byung-hoon coordinating the staff with his usual quiet efficiency. Amara was at one of the cleared tables near the kitchen corridor and entrance, helping a young server stack the last of the dessert plates. She was still in the burgundy dress with her heels off, standing in stockinged feet on the marble floor, stacking plates with the unself-conscious practicality of someone who has spent a lot of her life in kitchens and doesn't think of helping as beneath her. The young server, a woman who couldn't have been older than 19, was saying something quietly to her, and Amara was listening with the particular quality of attention she gave everyone, fully, without half her mind somewhere else. Jae-hyun stopped at the entrance to the ballroom and watched her for a moment. He thought about the 2 suitcases she'd arrived with, one with clothes, one with her grandfather's journals. He thought about what it had taken to carry those 2 suitcases into this house, and the specific kind of courage it required to decide, in a house this cold and this controlled, to be warm anyway. To do the warm thing in the dark, without permission or acknowledgement, for 4 months, because it was right. He crossed the room. Amara looked up when he got close. She handed the last stack of plates to the server and said something to her that made the young woman smile, and then the young woman took the plates and was gone, and it was just the 2 of them standing in the half-cleared ballroom. Seo and Lim, she said. Handled. She nodded. She looked at the room around them, the tables, the remaining staff, the space where an hour ago 114 people had been. It's a lot, she said. Not a complaint, just naming something accurately. Yes. She looked at him. She had mascara very faintly smudged under her left eye from earlier,
and she hadn't fixed it, and her hair was slightly less organized than it had been at the beginning of the evening. She was tired. She was also looking at him with the directness she always looked at him with. No performance, no navigation, just the face she actually had. "Are you all right?" she asked. Nobody asked him that. In his memory, in the 31 years of running this organization, he could not identify the last time someone had asked him that question and meant it as a genuine inquiry rather than a social ritual. He stood with the question for a moment. "No," he said. "Not entirely. Not yet." She looked at him. "Okay," she said. That was all. No follow-up, no reassurance, no managed response. Just okay. The acknowledgement of what was true without the pressure to make it something else. He stood in the emptying ballroom and felt something in his chest loosen slightly. The smallest increment, barely measurable. But there. "Come on," she said. "I'll make something. You haven't eaten anything real tonight." He looked at her. "The dinner. You talked through dinner and then you handled 2 men in a conference room, and before that you spent 6 days restructuring the financial architecture of an organization while also managing a legal crisis." She picked up her shoes by the straps and turned toward the kitchen corridor. "Come on." He followed her. The service kitchen at midnight was quiet and warm and smelled of the evening's preparations still hanging in the air. Amara moved through it with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly where everything is and doesn't need to think about the logistics of the space. She put water on. She opened the refrigerator and stood in front of it and took inventory with her eyes. Jae-hyun sat on a stool at the prep counter and took off his jacket and put it on the counter beside him and loosened his tie. He couldn't remember the last time he'd sat in this kitchen. He had walked through it 1,000 times. It was a functional space, like all the other functional spaces in the estate, noted and passed. He had never sat in it. He sat on the stool and watched her cook. She made rice. She always started with rice, he realized. He had noticed this in the brief seconds he'd spent watching through the kitchen door over the past weeks without announcing himself. Rice as the foundation, the thing that held everything else. Then eggs, broken into a bowl and beaten with chopsticks with a quick practiced wrist motion. Something from the refrigerator. Green onion, which he set aside on the cutting board in its own small pile, which he understood now was habit. She set it aside automatically for people who didn't eat it, and she did it even when she was cooking for only one person or two. He looked at that small pile of green onion on the cutting board. "You do that automatically," he said. She looked at where he was looking. "Old habit. Dough. Dough." She smiled slightly, not a big smile, just the small kind that happens when something is simply true. "It took me 2 weeks to notice, another week to remember every time." She turned back to the range. "Your grandfather teaches you something, and you think you understand it, and then 20 years later you're standing in a kitchen in Los Angeles setting aside green onion for a 61-year-old Korean man who doesn't know you noticed, and you think, oh, that's what he meant." Jae-hyun was quiet. "He meant it's the small things," she said. "Not the grand gestures. Anybody can do a grand gesture. The small things are what take attention, real attention." She moved the eggs in the pan. "Most people don't pay real attention because it costs something. It costs you being present, being inconvenienced, caring about someone else's small specific reality when your own large general reality is pressing on you." She glanced back at him. "You know what I mean. You pay that kind of attention to threat, to operational detail. You're one of the most observant people I've been around." He looked at her. "You just aimed it at problems," she said. "Not people." She set the food in front of him. Rice, eggs, something simple and warm and not decorated, not elaborate. The kind of food that doesn't apologize for itself. She poured tea and set the cup beside the plate, and then she leaned against the counter across from him and wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at him. He ate. It was quiet in the kitchen. Somewhere outside the estate's grounds, the city was doing what cities do at midnight. Moving, exhaling, running its parallel lives in the dark. In here, the water in the kettle was still ticking as it cooled and the range was off, and the overhead light was on its low setting, and it was, Jae-hyun thought, the least complicated room he had been in for the past 10 days. He ate the whole plate. He didn't notice finishing until the plate was empty. Amara was watching him with the expression that had taken him months to correctly read. Not analysis, not judgment, just attention. The real kind that costs something. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I brought you into this house and I didn't see you. 7 months. You were present and you were not in my field of attention in the way you should have been." He looked at the empty plate. "I don't say that as a—" He stopped. He was not practiced at this. "I'm not explaining it. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you deserve to hear it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I knew what I was agreeing to. That doesn't make it right." "No," she said. "It doesn't." She set her tea down. "I was angry about it for a while, the first 2 months. I kept thinking, he walks past me like I'm part of the hallway, like I'm furniture that was installed for a purpose, and the purpose is satisfied just by being here." She paused. "Then I went to the kitchen, and I stopped needing you to see me because I found something in this house that needed me for what I actually was, not what I was arranged to represent." He looked at her. "I'm not saying that to hurt you," she said. "I'm saying it because it's true, and because you deserve to hear it." He recognized his own words coming back to him. Something in his face moved. "Fair," he said. "I did want you to see me," she said. "Eventually. When the kitchen was going and the men were different, and I thought, maybe now he'll notice. Maybe now whatever is between us has room to be something. And then you walked in and told everyone they'd be accountable for entering the kitchen, and you looked at me and then you left." She picked up her tea. "That was a bad night." "I know. Do you know why?" He thought about it. "Because you'd built something real, and I made it feel like a violation." She nodded. Her hands moved around the cup. "I had one moment where the person I'd been trying to be seen by finally saw me, and what I got back was the organization reasserting its own rules." She paused. "That's what it felt like." He sat with that. He didn't rush to fill the silence because the silence was doing something. It was holding what she'd said so that it could be what it was without being immediately covered over. "I was afraid of it," he said finally. She looked at him. "What you'd built. The way the room was when I walked in. 53 people who were different. Not my men in the way my men are mine. Something else. I didn't have language for it, and I didn't trust what I couldn't language, and I defaulted to control." He looked at his hands on the counter. "That is what I do when I encounter something I don't understand." "I know," she said, not unkindly. "I'm working on it." She studied him. The look went on long enough that he felt it, not as pressure, but as something more like measurement. The look of someone deciding whether to believe a thing based not on the words alone, but on everything surrounding them. "I know that too," she said. The legal counterclaim was filed 11 days later. Ji-yeon's team built it with the precision of a controlled demolition, each element placed to remove structural support from the trend claim without creating secondary damage to the Kang organization's legitimate operations. Lim and Seo's testimony was central, documented, and specific, providing the evidentiary chain that demonstrated the trend claim rested on information obtained through channels that constituted a breach of confidentiality and potentially criminal interference in business operations. The Trin organization withdrew the claim 43 days after it was filed. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final meeting at a lacquered table. The withdrawal arrived through lawyers, documented and clean, the organizational equivalent of a door closing quietly at the end of a long corridor. The Port of Long Beach operation continued without interruption. The financial architecture was restructured around the gaps Han had created. 3 accounts were dissolved, 4 new channels were established with tighter monitoring, and Byung-hoon implemented a quarterly audit protocol that had not previously existed because it hadn't previously seemed necessary. Han Seok-won was removed from the organization structure with a settlement that was precise and non-negotiable. He relocated to Vancouver within 3 months. Jae-hyun did not speak to him again. There was nothing left to say that the settlement documents hadn't already said more efficiently. Cha Dong-hyun's situation was more complicated, as 22-year situations tend to be. The full accounting of what he'd given the Trin organization required weeks to reconstruct. The damage was real, significant, and not entirely repairable. There were operational details about the Northern California structure that would have to be permanently altered, relationships rebuilt, positions reshuffled. 3 months of organizational work that rippled outward from a man sitting at his desk in Oakland, not running, waiting for what was coming. Jae-hyun went to Oakland himself, once, near the end. He sat across from Cha in a room that was not the warehouse and not a formal office. A neutral space, a conference room in a building that was adjacent to everything but not part of it. Cha was 63 years old, and he looked, in this room, all of it. His face had gone somewhere in the weeks since Oakland. The performance that had taken 22 years to build had come down, and what was left was just a man who was tired in the specific way that betrayal tires people out. Not from the betrayal itself, but from the years of maintaining it, the daily maintenance of a false self, the weight of living inside a constructed version of your own loyalty. Jae-hyun looked at him for a long time without speaking. "Why?" he said finally. Cha looked at the table, then at the wall, then at Jae-hyun, and the look held. The Trin organization offered a structure where I wasn't always standing in someone else's shadow, he said. Your father's shadow first, then yours. 22 years and I was still positioned, still lateral. He stopped. I told myself it was strategy, that I was protecting my own interests, that it was reasonable. He shook his head slightly. It wasn't. No. I should have left, Cha said, when I started feeling it, the resentment. When it started changing what I was doing, I should have come to you and said I needed to move on, taken the settlement and gone. He looked at his hands. I didn't have the courage for the honest thing, so I did the other thing. Jae-hyun sat with that. He thought about Min Kyung in the household office with a phone in her hand. He thought about Lim and Seo talking to Han about transition instead of coming to him directly. He thought about himself 7 months ago, seeing a kitchen full of his men and walking out without saying anything real. Nobody in this situation had the courage for the honest thing, he said, including me. Cha looked at him. Something shifted in the old man's face. Not gratitude, not exactly, but the specific relief of someone who expected condemnation and received something more complicated. I can't undo the damage, Jae-hyun said, and you know what the accounting is, but I needed to hear it from you directly. He stood. That's all. He left Cha in the room and walked out into the Oakland afternoon. Gray sky, cold air off the bay, the smell of the port 2 miles east. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a moment and breathed it in. 31 years. The empire he'd built and everything it cost and everything it revealed about him in the building. He had controlled people through fear and called it loyalty and called it strength and never stopped to ask what it was actually producing, what kind of men it made, what kind of organization, what kind of home. He thought about Amara standing in the kitchen at midnight with the range light on and 53 men who came because they wanted to, not because they were told to. He thought about what she'd said. Knowing someone's weakness isn't the same as knowing them. He had built his entire life on the former and called it the latter. He got in the car and drove back to Los Angeles. The dining hall opened on a Tuesday in November. It wasn't announced formally. Hae-hyun had the renovation done. An unused section of the east wing cleared and properly outfitted. Long tables, a connected kitchen that was adjacent to the service kitchen, but larger, equipment that was sufficient for feeding significant numbers without strain. The work took 3 weeks, and when it was finished, it was functional and clean and undecorated except for the natural warmth of a room designed for people to be in. Amara walked through it the morning before it opened. She stood in the middle of the empty room and looked at the tables and the kitchen and the windows on the east side that let in the morning light in long, flat rectangles across the floor. Jae-hyun stood at the entrance and watched her. She turned around and looked at him across the length of the room. It's good, she said. The kitchen is more than I need. It's good. He came into the room. He walked to where she was standing and looked at the space from her position. The morning light was doing something particular to the room, making it look both larger and more human, the way good light does. I should have done this 7 months ago, he said. You didn't know 7 months ago. I should have asked. She looked at him. Yes, you should have. She said it without anger, just with the flat accuracy she gave to true things. But you're doing it now. He nodded. She looked back at the room. I want to change one thing in the kitchen setup. The prep counter placement. Tell Byung-hoon he'll have it done today. She looked at him sideways. Something in her expression was lighter than it had been in the months he'd been learning to read her. Not lighter as in less serious, lighter as in less guarded. The particular expression of someone who has decided to put weight down that they've been carrying. Okay, she said. The first dinner in the new hall happened that evening. Amara cooked. She'd had staff help with the preparation. She wasn't alone in the kitchen, the way she'd been in the midnight service kitchen. There were 2 kitchen employees working alongside her, and the scale was different, but the food itself came from the same place it always had. Her grandfather's journals were on the counter, open to 2 pages she'd marked with a folded piece of paper. She moved between the journals and the prep counter without stopping to read them carefully. She'd carried these recipes for long enough that they lived in her hands rather than her eyes. She only checked the pages when she was uncertain, and she wasn't uncertain often. Do Kwang-soo came early. He came in through the kitchen entrance, which was not the expected route, and stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the operation with the expression he brought to all new situations: total assessment, minimal display. He watched for about 30 seconds. Smells right, he said. Dough, she said without looking up from the prep counter. Go sit down. You're making the new staff nervous. He looked at the 2 kitchen employees who were in fact somewhat nervous in the presence of the oldest man in the organization, and he turned and went to sit down. He sat at the end of the long table, and he was the first one there, and one by one the others came. Ryu Tae-young, who had gotten a different assignment after Oakland, closer in, more responsibility, Sungjin had recommended it and Jae-hyun had agreed, came in with 2 other young men and sat halfway down the table. Sungjin came in and sat across from Do, which was unusual for Sungjin, who typically positioned himself for sightlines rather than proximity. He sat across from Do, and the 2 men who had spent 15 years in the same organization without exchanging more than operationally necessary words sat across from each other and didn't speak, which was its own kind of companionship. Byung-hoon came in with his tablet and then set the tablet face down on the table, which was a thing Jae-hyun had never once seen him do. Jae-hyun came in last. He came in through the main entrance rather than the kitchen, and he stood for a moment in the doorway and looked at the room. The tables filling, the noise of people arriving and sitting and talking in the relaxed, slightly overlapping way of people who are in a space they feel comfortable in. The light was warm. The smell from the kitchen was layered and particular and already doing what it always did, reaching the part of the brain that remembers things without language. He found a seat in the middle of the table. Not the head. The middle. Sungjin looked at him and then looked back at his own hands. Do looked at him with the expression that wasn't quite a look, and wasn't quite anything else. The expression that Do reserved for things he approved of, but was not going to say he approved of. Amara came out of the kitchen and set things on the table, moving efficiently, not performing service, just placing food where it could be reached, and then going back for the next things. When she'd put the last dishes down, she stood and looked at the table and made a small adjustment to the placement of a serving bowl, and then she sat down. She sat beside Jae-hyun, not across. Beside. He looked at her. She was looking at the table, checking the distribution, making sure the food was reachable from all points, the way she always thought about whether the room was working, not aesthetically but functionally, whether the people in it had what they needed. He picked up the serving spoon and put food on her plate first. She looked at the plate and then looked at him. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who is learning something that is not easy to learn and is learning it in public and has decided that is acceptable. She picked up her chopsticks. Around them, the table was moving and talking, and the food was being passed, and the room was doing what it was designed to do. What 43 years of his grandfather's restaurant had understood before the journals were written. What her grandfather had taught in recipes and in the space between recipes. What she had carried in 2 suitcases into this cold fortress of a house and had refused to set down even when the cold pressed in from every direction. A young recruit who had been with the organization for 3 weeks, he barely knew anyone's name yet. He was still in the phase of learning who to avoid and who to watch for cues, sat near the end of the table and looked at the room with the confused attention of someone encountering something they don't have a category for yet. He leaned toward the man beside him, a driver named Cho, who had been around long enough to have eaten soup in the dark service kitchen a dozen times before the new hall existed. "Why does everyone change when Mrs. Kang is in the room?" the recruit asked quietly. "They're different, even the senior people." Cho put food on his own plate and thought about it. He thought about the first night he'd come to the service kitchen. Injured shoulder, 4 a.m., a woman he'd never spoken to handing him a bowl of soup like it was the most natural thing in the world, and asking him how his shoulder felt without anyone having told her his shoulder was hurt. He thought about how he'd gone back the next night, and the night after that, how he'd told his crew about it, and they'd come, and then more people had come, and the darkness of the kitchen hadn't been darkness anymore. It had just been late. "Boss Kang built this," Cho said quietly. He looked across the table at Jae-hyun, who was listening to something Byung-hoon had leaned in to say, his expression attentive and less closed than it used to be, less the expression of a man being briefed and more the expression of a man listening. He built the whole structure, the whole operation, years of work. You can see it in every room of this place. He reached for the serving bowl. "But Mama Amara built the people who keep it alive." The recruit looked at Amara, who was saying something to Do Kwang-soo, something quiet. Do was looking at his plate, and she was speaking in a low voice, and Do was not responding, but his shoulders had changed. He was less assembled, more simply present, which in Do was a visible thing when you knew what you were looking for. Jae-hyun overheard Cho's words. He didn't show it, but beside him he felt Amara's attention shift slightly, and he understood from the particular quality of her stillness that she had heard them too. He didn't look at her. He looked at the table, at the food and the people, and the room that had been nobody's idea of a home for 30 years and was now, improbably, through the accumulated weight of small attentions and midnight meals and the stubborn insistence of a woman with a ladle on treating people like they were worth knowing, something else. He reached over and put more food on her plate. She looked at him sideways. "You made it," he said. "Eat." She looked at the plate. Then she picked up her chopsticks again and she ate. Outside the estate's windows, Los Angeles moved through its November dark. The city that had no winter, that went on without stopping, indifferent to the empires built inside its boundaries, and the people who built them, and what it cost. The guards moved along the tree line on their scheduled rotation. The city's distant noise came over the wall in waves, just sound, just the background of a world that didn't know and didn't need to know what was happening inside this room. Inside the room, the food was warm, and the table was full, and the people sitting at it had survived things. Each of them, in their different ways, had come through something, and they were here, eating, talking, being known by each other in the small specific ways that accumulate over months of shared meals into something that resembles, without quite being, and in some ways surpassing what resemblance could offer. A family. Do Kwang-soo ate his broth. There was no green onion in it. He finished it and set his chopsticks down and looked at the middle of the table for a moment, which was what Do did when something was as it should be and he had no complaint to register. He did not say anything. He didn't need to.